Okay. So hi everyone. So my name is Maria Martelli, and I'm a writer and scholar activist and independent researcher based in Romania in Eastern Europe. And here I will basically present a part of my research on pigeon-human pigeon-human relationships, which I started some time ago, but really just recently I started thinking about it in terms of multi-species justice. So what I'm presenting here is more like what the questions that I have now that I think it through this framework. So it's more open and a work in progress. So I'm looking forward to your ideas if you have any. So multi-species justice, as explained by Danielle Claire-Meyer and others, seeks to understand the types of relationships humans ought to cultivate with more than human beings, so as to produce just outcomes. Okay, so actually, it's a bit weird that I started thinking about this just recently in the context of my research of pigeons, because actually I researched multi-species justice already in 2020 when we were working at within the project Just Wondering on the short film We Fly, We Crawl, We Swim, which is about climate justice. And what we tried to do with the film was bring an anti-speciesist point of view in the discussion about climate justice. And we explored what it might mean to make justice with other animals. So that was when I actually started to think about this. But then when I started researching pigeons, I started from the ground up, from the things that were happening here in Romania with relationship with pigeons. And just recently, I came back to this concept of justice. So, yeah, one of the first things that's important regarding multi-species justice, I think, is that it's basically rethinking the subject of justice. So generally the subject of justice used to be centered about this human that was always rational and capable, like a sort of ideal human image. And then the subject of justice started to be rethinked. And in the context of multi-species justice, it even goes further. So Claire-Meyer and others write that approaching justice through multi-species lens means that any conception of the individual, be it the individual being or the individual species, needs to be recast as essentially constituted within relationships. So one of the claims here is that basically we're not just looking at individuals anymore, but we're looking at relationships, which means that we don't need to look for particular capacities or affordances if we go into justice like this, if we think of it as a relationship. And then further on, Claire-Meyer and O'Brien write about transitional justice, which is basically a sort of justice that is amenable to context of ongoing wrongdoing, and it can work from the present, from the wrongdoing that is right now. It works with in human only cases, so to say, and then they try to apply to a more than human context. And basically, it has different mechanisms. It has like a sort of toolkit. So, for example, it can use trials or reconciliation commissions, institutional reforms of apologies. So there are a few things about it that it's like a toolkit. And another thing important about it that I think really inspired me to work through it with my case is that it has this double temporality. So it looks backward, acknowledging the wrongdoings of the past, and it also looks forward, establishing different norms for a more just context. So in my case, and I'm looking specifically at pigeons and humans, what I first try to do is understand this relationship in broad terms. So I looked a bit at its history. So when I say pigeon, I mean the feral pigeon, which is Columba livia in Latin.
And basically, this is a very a relationship that has lasted for a very long time. It started with the domestication of the wild rock pigeon, which is not clear exactly when it happened, but it's like probably 5,000 years ago, with the rise of the production of grain, and agriculture. And it was domesticated for meat. And I choose here to emphasize the ways that this relationship was always centered around humans and around what use these pigeons would bring to human societies. So one of the things after being raised for meat was that their fertilizer was very valued. Their dung as fertilizer, this is what I mean. Then they were used as messengers, and this happened ever since the Greeks, the Romans, Persians, and Syrians, and almost to the modern day age, until the internet almost. They have been used in various contexts. And then, of course, they have this symbolic value. They are used in religious ceremonies, and they have been sacrificed. And then, at some point, this pigeon keeping started to decline, and it started to decline again in relationship to how we related to agricultural practice. So they were domesticated with the rise of grain, and then the pigeon keeping starting to decline with the rise of industrial agricultural practices that developed other techniques for fertilizing the land, and then of course the breeding of chickens, which was much more profitable and worked quicker, produced more meat than with the pigeons. And then in more modern day age, so to say, they were used in scientific experiments, so in producing scientific knowledge. One famous example is Darwin's pigeons, which he studied so as to prove the theory of evolution. And another famous example would be the behavioral psychologist P.F. Skinner's pigeon project, in which he tried to train pigeons to conduct missile attacks, which leads me to, I will jump over that, to the use within wars. They have been used in wars as messengers, but I highlight this specifically in wars because it was definitely more dangerous for them to be used in wars. And there are even pigeons remembered as heroes. For example, Cherami, who is famous for delivering a message from an encircled battalion despite having had serious injuries in World War I. And then going back, they are used for entertainment and companionship. There are pet pigeons, but then there are racing pigeons and also fancy pigeons, each one of them being bred for a particular ability or like a way in which they look. And then now the present, in Western cities, basically they have become useless. So after this very long history of having been used, becoming useless leads to their classification as a pest and nuisance and threat with wings, which is what they are often called in a sort of derogatory way, both to them and the rats, I suppose. So then when looking at this history, I think sets us on the context to think about justice. And what I think is maybe interesting to note is that part of it is not unique to pigeons, right? Because many other species have been used and undergone similar treatment. But what is different about pigeons, I think, is that they are no longer exploited on a large scale, but rather that the problem with them is that they are invisibilized and marginalized. So in a way, I think we could say that arguing for them is a bit less difficult because most humans don't have an interest in exploiting or oppressing them. But in another way, the indifference that is surrounding them is just so strong that it's really very hard to make a compelling case for pigeons. But looking at it in terms of justice and considering the whole history, I think there's a big question first. So what does a 1,000-year-old relationship entail for multi-species justice, which
sets us to think structurally and really broadly. And then there's a more pointed question that helps us to look at particular relationships, right? Like who, where, how have they been involved? This is the question I think that can actually help us understand what we can do in specific cases, in places, for example, like London and Venice and Timișoara in Romania, where pigeons have been fed by people for a very long time, like specific generations of pigeons, and then this feeding has stopped. And I think both of these are helpful in thinking further. So even going further on and looking at this relationship, and trying to categorize it, I see that it is a relationship of exploitation that led to unequally distributed benefits, because they have been forced to serve human interests for thousands of years. So I think I would note here that it's not just a question of the injustice that comes from unequally distributed benefits and risk, but really a question of power from which all of those stem, because human societies have become more powerful as a result of having dominated more than human nature. So domination is at the base of this unequal distribution. Like Erika Kudrot writes about anthroparchy, right? The system of relationships in which the environment is dominated by human beings. So I think when we talk about justice, we need to pay attention to power. And in response to this context, I think one question would be, how can anthroparchy become undone? How can it be untangled so as to be able to make multi-species justice possible? The second thing that we see is that it's a relationship of domination and genetical modification that led to anthropodependence, a term that ethologist Roberto Marchesini uses to mean the tie of dependence, partial or total, that humans have imposed through the process of domestication. So now this difference is different for every species. And in the case of the feral pigeons, it's really not so clear, because feral pigeons don't depend on human care directly, but they depend on the human space, which is conceptualized as an anthropocentric space and is designed only for humans. And so they really don't belong to any sort of so-called wild nature. They really belong in the city, within its buildings. And as such, I think they raise the need to think of the more than human city. And moreover, just to ask, what does justice look like towards those we have genetically altered to favor our designs? And I think this question, again, points us to processes that we can undertake of recognition, for example, of their place in the city, and then maybe of distribution of space and taking their needs into consideration. And third, what I think is important is that we have a violent relationship that brought suffering and pain. So maybe in the present, this is not so clear anymore, especially in Western cities, in which pigeon keeping is really quite sparse, but there are other issues even there. So we have invisibilization, deployment of pest control, string-fed mutilation, and health problems caused by environmental factors. So as such, I think the guiding question could be, what can multi-species justice learn from transformative justice movements? And then we see that transformative justice aims to challenge all aspects of domination and control within society today. It really is like a justice movement that tries to reshape the base, the context in which injustice is done. So I think this is really helpful in thinking through these contextual pigeon-human relationships, and maybe even learning from the processes that it uses, like mediation, negotiation, and community circles, because its aim at the base is really towards liberation. And I think maybe there are some ties that we can draw towards it. And then looking at all of this, I am thinking, what are our ideas for animal futures? How can we go towards that? Towards multi-species and post-humanist futures in which we humans recognize and honor animality, both ours and others, and in which we start to act from the knowledge that we are entangled, not individual. So one of the things is that the city has never been human only from the very beginning, right? Even as Roberto Marchesini states that animals in the city become constrained to reserved areas, and that, generally we just try to put them out. We need the recognition that this is not and it's not even possible, and it has never been like that. So in terms of multi-species justice, this puts us on a path of seeking not only recognition, but representation of other animals in the political realm and the distribution of space and resources. A second idea, I think, is just to learn from sanctuary practices. So sanctuaries are places in which some of these, in which these relationships are transformed, in which domination is really, human domination is challenged, and in which animals and their needs and desires are centered. So just learning from what they're doing, and of course, not just taking it for granted, but thinking critically through it, but understanding that they are these frontier spaces is really helpful. And in the picture, you can see pictures from the bird sanctuary Sepale that are at an art exhibition by Silvia Moldovan, who is an artist and is also a pigeon rescuer. And the third thing that I think would be useful is engaging in speculative fabulation. So storying other worlds is one way of showing and telling and just bringing forward emotionally and viscerally other types of multi-species relationships, right? Like what Donna Haraway called speculative fabulation in her writings on the Children of Compost. So we can have many ways of doing that, and we can even start from what we already know from the past and the present, which is what I and Sylvia did in this short film that you can see a screen cap from. It's called In Time You Will See How the Sky is Great Enough. And the film superimposes images of pigeons from the sanctuary onto a history of pigeon-human relationships. And it envisions the future not only as unknowable, but even questions the desirability of knowing the future and, more importantly, shaping the future from the point of view of the anthropos. So these are some ideas that I have and questions and guides that I hope can guide me and us to explore more possibilities for multi-species justice and animal liberation. And I just want to conclude with this illustration from the short film about climate justice. And you can see it is visualizing a multi-species map of a landscape. And what it does is simply show and name in human language the fact that non-human beings are already there. So it's a visual representation of one aspect of multi-species justice. It's an act of recognition. Thank you.
Thank you. I really love the pictures. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Zoe, I didn't know if you wanted to run this or I could just continue running it, but I guess I beat you to the microphone. Sorry, just eating. I would suggest that we, actually, no, I'm changing my mind. Do we want to just do questions now? Because I do worry when we wait to the end, people forget about the first presenters. Just looking in the chat. Kate Stewart says, really interesting presentation. Alex's awesome presentation. Maybe we will move on then and to give people time to think about what they saw and how it relates to the other presentations. Unless Zoe, you have something.
I just had a quick question. I was just curious about the second thing you mentioned, Maria, when you were talking about learning from sanctuary practices. And I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit more about what that might look like with pigeons. Could you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and if anyone wants to write anything on the chat, please do, because I'm just thinking about this while I'm presenting it, and it's all very, I have a lot of work to do. So regarding your question, so regarding pigeons specifically, most people don't actually know how to care for pigeons in general, and vets don't even know. So when you find an injured pigeon, people don't know what to do about that. So just when I went there, it was so amazing to me because Sylvia has been like saving and rescuing and helping pigeons for like 10 years or more. It just happened that I brought the pigeon to her, and she had this whole routine, just looking everything, just the medical stuff, because even the medical stuff is not clear. And then she has this many separations that, how
in sanctuaries, fences are important to separate certain groups. So she has this for pigeons who have been ill, and then she lets them to the pigeons who are healthy, and then at some point she lets them out. So she has this sort of practices that basically amount to medical care, a lot of it, and then just, you know, letting them do their own thing and having their own space and having food, because it's basic stuff, but it doesn't happen within the cities. Pigeons have like this pretty tough life because the structure of the city, while it depends on the cities, and some buildings that are really good for them to nest upon, but people don't like that, so they put spikes, and there's a lot of hostile architecture. So it's really, I think it really starts from the basics. And you can see that with domesticated farm animals as well. Then vets have a certain way of looking at them, and like with cows, for example, there are certain illnesses, or when they grow older, they don't know what to do with them because they never grow older in the industry, and all of this stuff.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. You raised one more thing and then I'll stop talking. Someone else can ask a question. But I was just wondering about where you're living in the cities. What's it like to try, if you come across a pigeon, and I know you were mentioning medical care at the sanctuary, is your only option if you come across a pigeon who is injured to take them to the sanctuary, or like, can you take pigeons to vets? I know in South Australia, I've taken a pigeon to the vet before and they kind of went, oh, yeah, we'll definitely help them. And then I later found out that the policy was just to euthanize them no matter what.
Well, this is the only pigeon sanctuary that I know of, and it's just in one city in Romania. So what other people do, it's kind of either send her a WhatsApp message and ask her to step by step what to do. And she's like the only person that I know, but there are other people that handle birds, especially wild birds. We have some other organizations for that, but pigeons, no, right? Because pigeons are not wild, and then pigeons are not domestic. And what are pigeons? You know, they're just nowhere in any category.
Roger, you also had a question.
Yes, hi. A nice presentation, Maria. So, but what you said about elderly farmed animals and other animals in general just reminded me of something that happened where there was a rescued piglet one time, and he obviously grew up. The activist, in their ironic way, named him Rasha, and but Rasha became ill, and so they called the vet in, agricultural vet. And the vet said, I can't help this pig. And they said, why not? You're a vet. And he said, yeah, but I've never seen a pig this old before. And so that tells its own kind of story in that sense as well. I just thought I'd throw that in.
Yeah, thank you. I think a lot of it really amounts to the basics, the fact that the veterinary, how it's taught towards, you know, animal farming and the pets industry. So this is what it serves, like the whole amount of veterinary science. Well, maybe not the whole, I'm exaggerating here. And I say this because in my other work with the sanctuary, I have studied this other sanctuary in which began with saving a cow that had a broken foot, and the woman who saved her, she tried so hard to find somebody to do the what's it called, operation on the foot, and she tried so hard that she just found somebody who was willing to do it, and then she found somebody else from another country who had done it, and they talked on the phone, and this other veterinary person was guiding the one in Romania, and it was the first such operation done on a cow in Romania. And it's just, you know, trying very hard, basically, is what we can do.
I think one interesting thing about sanctuaries is that the people running them end up knowing more about other animals than vets do. And they can guide vets quite a lot because, as I said, there is a limited amount of knowledge for vets, in the sense that even the agricultural ones, because they're almost like to assist the farming process. And so they're not used to elderly other animals, you know.
I think that's a whole thing to research, how the combination of this whole anthroparchy and the veterinary science
how it stacks together and creates a certain kind of knowledge that is the knowledge of domination.
I think it's time to move on now. We do actually, as an administrative note, we are going to have Lynda come on next, but Luke, the dog and cat are getting into it. We thought Luke had dropped out, but Luke has returned. I think Luke, yeah, I see Luke in the chat there. So what we had is we were going to get Roger to pop in to cover for Luke, but now Luke is here. So what we thought we would offer is that if we will probably go over the hour time now for sure, but if people are interested and want to hang around and watch Roger's talk on vegan advocacy or vegan campaigning rather over the recent decade or so, which he actually sent me a link to this last night and I watched it and thought it was extremely relevant to the conversations we're having this weekend. So if folks want to stick around for that during the break, you're more than welcome to do so, because after this panel, we just have one more panel to go, the Polish Sociological Association folks. So Lynda, without further ado, are you ready to rock and roll?
Sure am. Let me just share this. Hopefully it'll work.
All right, you're looking good.
Okay, splendid. Just have to give it a minute to actually start. So I guess this follows a little bit on from what Maria was talking about in terms of justice. And the point of this, I've not got a paper on it as such, it's just a presentation that links from some study I had to do as part of my master's a couple of years back. And how interesting I find the issue of justice when it's not that long ago that we would have held animals directly responsible for their actions. So it's interesting how they didn't end up with rights because of it. So I thought I'd just go over some, I said UK animal trials in the paper title, but it's really more general than that. It's not always the UK. So I thought I'd kind of set the scene a little bit before I give you some examples of how this used to happen. So the who, what, when, and where of non-human animal trials, and it would depend on the species, but really there were no species of non-human that weren't privy to this. There are examples of weevils being tried for crime and so on. So things that we would recognize as perhaps more wildlife, things that we would consider or that society considers more pests, like the pigeons that Maria's talking about. Certainly that's how they're viewed in Scotland. And more what we would, or what some people refer to as domesticated animals, such as dogs and cats. So there were, again, like I say, not long ago, genuine prosecutions for criminal charges leveled against some non-humans in our society. Not so much recently, but the first recorded, or at least the first that's believed to be, happened was 1266, but it's not that long ago since the last recorded case of this. It is predominantly European. There were a few cases in the UK, but it would depend on what species of animal it was or what category they would fall into as to how they were treated and what their trial would look like. So domesticated so-called animals would be tried as individuals or maybe small groups in a secular court, and other animals that were considered pests would be tried in larger groups in a religious tribunal, which was particularly interesting. That was usually because that would be the kind of thing to do with damage to property, so eating a bunch of crops or what have you. For cats and dogs and pigs as well, it would be something that had happened that perhaps there would be injury to a human. Give me a second, my darling. Thanks, honey. So how they went about that is no different from how criminal cases are prosecuted to this day. There would be defence attorneys, prosecutors, witnesses, people brought in that had something to say about the situation, and charges laid against the accused in the same way as we would charge an accused human to just now. The complainant didn't have to make an accusation, and that's the case here as well in current days. You know, the Procurator Fiscal, as it is in Scotland anyway, can make the accusation and try someone even if the victim, so-called, doesn't wish for that to be pursued. So interesting kind of dynamic of decisions made by people in power, but it all came down to property. And this is why the owners of the property, i.e. the non-humans on trial, would be charged for the costs of the trial and any subsequent imprisonment or death, because obviously that was appropriate at the time. Some non-humans even ended up in the jail beside the human prisoners, which was particularly interesting. And I guess it would depend on what species you end up sharing a cell with. Anyway, I'm saying it's a famous case. I'm not sure that it is, but a 5-year-old child had been killed, and the suspected perpetrators of this crime were a sow and her 6 piglets. They were all covered in blood and whatever. They were imprisoned immediately, and within a month they were on trial. So certainly the wheels of justice worked a lot faster back then than they tend to do now. The piglets, however, had blood on them, but there wasn't so much evidence that they could be, that they weren't prosecuted. They were acquitted. And what's particularly interesting about that is that they were acquitted, but the owner, so-called, was told that they would have to take the piglets back if further evidence became clear. The sow was found guilty, hanged from a tree by her hind legs, which does suggest to me that that would have been quite a slow and pretty grim death. But the piglets, like I say, were acquitted. The owner did not wish to have the responsibility of having to potentially take the piglets back for trial at some future date should some other evidence appear. So he forfeited ownership of the piglets because he didn't want the responsibility anymore. So that was probably the kind of the biggest one, certainly in all the animal criminology literature, of which there is some, as the kind of the key case that's mentioned. That's just for a bit of lighthearted relief. It's not really another Burgundy case, but in Burgundy, Duke Philip the Bold, who sounds very grand, 1379. Again, it was another situation where there had been violence against a human, and instead of dealing with this as you would expect things would happen now, most of the herds of swine that were accused in this case were spared. I say that in inverted commas because they would have just gone back to being what they were raised for, which was essentially food and human use. The 4 found most guilty, and it's unclear what all the details was that made them decide which of the herd were and weren't responsible. The fact that they were dealt with like this, though, and this is what I was saying at the beginning, there's some kind of implicit notion then that if you can try a non-human as a human, then they're part of the same community of justice as humans, and therefore potentially might be privy to rights as well, like going back to the Tom Regan chat from during the break. In terms of the UK or Britain, certainly, there are a few cases listed in some of the documentation from the time. But once you try to dig down, not me personally, but the people that were interested in this and start to dig down a little bit, that the evidence is quite scant, is a little bit dubious as to exactly the details of everything. But there have been a few cases, one in Scotland in particular, which is interesting to me, of course. But this isn't restricted to animals that you would find in farmed spaces or in wildlife. And you'll see there that there are also examples of other species that you would be surprised would be held responsible for anything, including dolphins in particular. But as with, and it links to something I was speaking about recently, and we'll talk about in a moment about seals and how often the very fact that you have a seal has to eat fish and the fish are owned by someone sometimes, and that then is considered to be problematic as part of this. There weren't any foxes documented in the literature, but as we know from certainly having done a bit of sabbing in my time, foxes get a rough deal. So yeah, there was a whole bunch of processes would happen in order for these animals to be brought to trial, and sometimes even I've said there, locusts, slugs, mice, and grasshoppers would be called up for trial. The community that were having an issue with whichever species it was would go to the church, and this was only in cases of property damage, so crops being eaten or those kinds of things. They would go to the church and ask for help. The animals would be summoned to appear, often by having a message sent by one of its species to the rest of them, a rat or something being told to go and tell the rest of the rat community in the area that they were wanted in court on a particular day. Anyway, this is how the process would happen. And here's an example of slugs in particular. So, funnily enough, slugs eat plants, and they were notified by somebody marching around town that they were to leave the area or be cursed forever. And if they didn't, then yeah, they would be destroyed or killed. So, and this was quite commonplace, you know, this kind of, you must all go, we don't want you here. If they relocated, that would be okay. They would become someone else's problem, and I dare say go through the same process again in the future. Okay, sweetie. Excuse me, I'm on. Bye, gorgeous. Yeah, didn't usually work because, funnily enough, slugs probably can't move fast enough to tell the entire slug community. In any case, there were, sorry, that's put me right off my stride there. Yeah, there'd be a message sent out and everyone was supposed to heed it that was accused of the crime. Now, if you're in the business of defending criminals, then there's a bit of money to be made from this. And Bartholomew Chassanet did make quite a bit of money and a bit of a name for himself in a similar case to do with rats. So how dare the rats eat the local barley? But they did, and so they were summoned to attend court because they had destroyed the property of the barley farmer. They didn't turn up, no surprises there, but they were excused from not turning up because there were some exceptions that could be made for someone, particularly if they were worried about maybe trying to get past the cats, the farmer's cats and stuff like that. So that's what the defence of them not turning up to court was. They might have missed the summons, they do move around a bit, and the cats might have been a bit of a problem. So that was okay. They were, the case was dropped against them, which is really interesting. A similar thing happened in the 1500s with a gang of weevils who had damaged a vineyard. They were acquitted because they were just eating what they eat. And actually, they were given their own vineyard as compensation, which is particularly interesting too. It's a shame we don't do that kind of thing now. So just to wrap this up, I'm saying just to wrap this up, these are the wordiest slides I've ever written in my life. So I apologise for it. It's just so I don't forget anything. I'm not very good with dates and things like that. There's a whole bunch of reasons that this might have been the case in the past, and linking to the sociological theory of functionalism to be seen as a deterrent. Corporal punishment and the public display of corporal punishment would be something in terms of human behaviour to try and deter other people from doing what, you know, that person's been hanged, let's not do what they do, take your kids along to the public hanging, chuck some tomatoes and that kind of thing. But this criminalisation of animals in a more humanistic way was really interesting. Lawyers built their own reputation and made a few bob out of it, made some money. But yeah, there was this idea that they would be an example. So if you owned other animals, you had to take care of them, especially in the cases of bigger animals that are subject to ownership, like pigs and donkeys and horses and things like that. There is a suggestion for those of you that are into criminology in particular, that this might link with Lombroso and his ideas of physiognomy, that people can just look like trouble. And going back to somebody was talking in another presentation about the cutification of animals. So certain animals would be more likely to be subject to this kind of accusation because they weren't maybe necessarily cute enough or popular enough to be considered any differently. Hasn't stopped though. What stopped is the fact that the animal can be actually considered as an individual in the same way. And I've given, there's loads of examples here. I won't go through them all. But if humans hurt other animals or are found out with their designated space, Maria was talking there about the kind of that restriction that some animals have, and the zoos are a perfect example of that actually. And there are plenty of examples of animals that have been confined in zoos and kept captive, finding, usually due to human neglect or negligence, that they end up harming a human being. Inevitably, they're killed for trying to protect their family, trying to defend themselves. And in the top case there, 1916, maybe having enough of the training regime of their existence, she was hanged from a crane until she died, in a similar way to the pig that I mentioned earlier. In Zanesville, the Zanesville massacres mentioned down there, 2011, an older man freed his exotic animal collection. 50 animals altogether were killed, including those wolves and bears and a lot of tigers and lions, and some monkeys as well, I think. So, but without all that kind of rigmarole of a trial that actually would maybe benefit them, it tends to be trial by media or shock of public, the moral panic that Stan Cohen spoke about. Dangerous dogs. We were talking about dogs during the break there, and we have still Dangerous Dogs Act here, and I guess other places. Big game hunting, another example of, or even some of the shooting of birds on estates. It becomes a sport, but it's also apparently necessary. And all of these have in common the fact that these non-humans are just doing what they do. They have to eat, and they eat what they have around them that's relevant to their biology. A good example of this is seals in Scotland. Seals eat salmon. There's a lot of salmon around Scotland. It's a salmon exporter. Salmons, I want to say, but it doesn't sound grammatically okay. Fishes, I'm okay with. Salmons, not so much. That's recently been amended. The fact that farmers could apply for a license to shoot the seals that were eating their, or damaging or risking damage to their fish stocks. And that's now been reneged, so it's no longer okay to kill seals just to protect your fish farm or to prevent any harm to the fish there, which is progress, only if even a little small. Since that came into effect, the start of last year, there's not been a single license granted to any fish farmer, whereas prior to that, they were killing hundreds a year. Harbour seals and grey seals in particular, who are not as common. So, questions to consider. There's a lot in the slide. I apologise again for that. And it links to the time and space kind of theme of the conference, which is why I suggested doing this in the first place, which is that how we deal with non-humans are a product of the space and time within which we live, right? So Cohen, Esther, not Stan, said perceptions and uses of justice are excellent mirrors of the mentality of an age. So in other words, the structures in place, the institutions surrounding the belief systems and the behaviours of people give a bit of a clue as to what's happening with our relationship with non-human animals in a particular time and a place. And it throws up a whole bunch of queries, though. If once we were able to hold animals responsible for their actions, although the owners would have to perhaps financially pay, the non-humans would pay with their lives, then if we can hold them responsible, then surely they must have qualified for some kind of rights in the same vein. So it brings up a whole bunch of questions, some of which I've asked here. If it's naturalistic behavior, like with the weevils and the grapes, then how natural is the environment maybe that they're in? Can you hold a mountain gorilla responsible for attacking something or someone that comes into its space that's already stressful and anxiety provoking? Anyway, I don't have much more to say about it. I just thought it would be a really interesting point of discussion to think about how animals have changed, our views of them have changed over space and time, whereas once we would have held our pig responsible for its behaviour, and now we just line them up in farrowing crates and all sorts and head them off to slaughter. So really interesting. There's a biography there, which I'll maybe share the slides with somebody. If you're interested, you can take a quick pick. And thanks for listening. That's me.
Thank you, Lynda. Grim stuff. Just looking to see if there's any comments. Erica Cudworth's been in here offering some stuff. Does anyone have any questions? I see he's always got a hand up. No? Hold over hand. Maria.
Yeah, I was just, I think it's really nice that our papers were like next to each other, because I was just thinking regarding what you said, that is one of the things that I think can be tried to do, this thinking through this concept of transformative justice, which really looks at the context in which wrongdoings appear and the structure of this context, right? So culpability is not in just the individual human, that is the case, but we can apply this to other animals. So when we have these issues in which, I mean, most clearly it would be, I mean, the words don't come to me in English today. Okay, so when a dog bites a human, right, the dog is at fault, and then the owner of the dog is at fault. But this is just a very not useful view of justice, this punitive stance, right? So then if we could have transformative justice in these cases, and you try to make justice, it would be interesting, right? Just look, why did this happen? In what context did this happen? These sorts of questions that maybe the situation was unjust to begin with.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the idea of transformative justice is still an issue for a lot of criminologists and justice seekers for humans, let alone for non-humans. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And there's always a very quick, swift resolution to these kinds of incidents that are usually, I mean, especially when you're talking about dogs, for example, which is down to just dogs not being in a great place, having been neglected, perhaps having experienced violence themselves, or inappropriately trained as opposed to, and then we're back to the pet question that Zoe was talking about earlier. Part of the issue for some of those animals are that they really shouldn't be confined in a house in the first place. But in any case, we're left with that. But yeah, there's the quick fix is just to kill them, get shot at them, and that's try again. And there's not really any acknowledgement maybe of the circumstances surrounding these incidents, that when you look at them in detail, like, well, of course a locust is going to eat this, or of course a weevil's going to eat some grapes, and of course a dog is going to attack someone that's attacked it, him, her, them. So yeah, it's an interesting idea. Somebody's probably working on it. I'm not going to claim any specialist knowledge in the field.
Lynda, we have one more question from Matthew, and then we'll wrap it up and move on to Luke's talk. But Matthew, of course, also in criminology, says he was thinking of Niles Christie and the ideal enemy counterpart to the ideal victim, with the construction of dangerous non-human animals as legitimate targets of persecution. He's wondering if you thought about these examples along those kinds of lines. And fascinating paper, he says.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm really sorry I turned down that offer of perhaps working with Matthew in criminological circles, but in any case, yeah, I mean, I guess that's the thing. It's like when I was saying about the moral panic that Stan Cohen spoke about in the 80s with, you know, it's a process that people go through that then to then criminalize a species before they've even done anything wrong, so to speak. You know, that I was thinking as well about how some animals are, they call it management, you know, of certain species that they worry about. So for example, the ruddy duck in Great Britain, it was there was a worry that the ruddy duck was going to mate with this other, you know, other bird species, and then that species would be done by. So instead, to save those birds, they were shooting all the other birds that were around about them, or the issue here that we have with squirrels quite often, that grey squirrels are bad and red squirrels are good, and we need to preserve the red over the grey at all costs. It's an invasive species and all this kind of, and this is all created by humanity in the first place, by transporting these species across lands and seas. Yeah, I think I don't even think I answered the question there. Yeah, but the ideal, what was it? How is it you put it? Perpetrator, essentially, which
Yeah,
can be
so
created.
ideal enemy.
Yeah, the ideal enemy that
Yeah.
can be created by media furore about all sorts of things. The same with dogs, and we've all seen plenty of examples across the world, dare say, of dangerous, so-called dangerous dogs. That's not to say that some of them would be safe to be out and about, but yeah, problematic though, for sure.
Cool, thanks very much. I'd love to, talk about this further outside the conference. It's fascinating stuff.
Definitely,
you.
Matthew, you're on.
Sorry, if I knew you were up and about, I would have gotten you to do your own question. I assumed you're like doing laundry or something like I ate yesterday. Okay, I guess I'll move on then. I'm going to give Luke plenty of time for the next presentation. And again, a friendly reminder, after Luke's talk, Roger is going to offer a talk on vegan campaigning in recent years with the large national nonprofits, if anyone wants to stick around for that. So Luke, are you ready to go? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to, thanks Corey and Zoe for organizing this and allowing us to join in and listen in to all these great talks. Thank you. Okay. It is the last day of 2059, marking the 10th anniversary of global carbon neutrality. I thought it was a good day for us to reflect on just the history, on history and the people and ideas that made the power of the modern ecological justice movement possible. The movement was a coalescing of ideas that galvanized the people in the outer rim of society. Without the pioneers, this world we know today might look very vastly different. This kinder, gentler world was made possible after a wave of democracy reforms that saw voices from the margins being pushed front and center. This is the story of how an ecological collapse was averted. Is the story of democracy reborn. Cities were once anthropocentrism writ large. Between 1980 through to much of the 2020s, city making was dominated by the privileged few. Oligopolies run largely by men working within a mechanistic paradigm that was market-driven, exploitative, and destructive. With the absence of the wild, social and ecological injustices were most visible in cities. Through a matrix of domination, hegemonic normative power was wielded through institutions and discourse to oppress people through all different kinds of frames, from race, gender, sexuality, class, physical or mental ability. This injustice was often compounded through intersectional oppressions. And the same matrix was used to dominate and exploit the more than human world. It became a galvanizing principle of the ecological justice movement that for us to flourish, we need everybody and every ecology to flourish. Ecological justice became the shorthand for a whole raft of ideas that were needed for the transformation. What we take as given now was fought for over many decades, in centuries. Basic services like housing, healthcare, public transport, and food were not always free. Indeed, they were often only accessible to those fortunate enough to afford them. The community-assisted urban permaculture that provides 80% of our food was ridiculed as impractical just 3 decades ago. Education did not always have eco-pedagogy at its center. Teachers did not always aim to develop a kind of eco-literacy that inspired and motivated action, as well as instill deep critical thinking. Cooperatives, workers' co-ops, and microfinance co-ops alike were not always the norm. We did not always have a guarantee of work. Our economic language proliferated with terms like degrowth, circular, shareable, and care. For example, when job guarantees recognized the value of care work, it was instrumental in closing the gender pay gap. It also encouraged more men to spend time with their kids, having a profound ripple effect that altered what it meant to be a man. Democracy in our cities moved from a time when white men could vote every 3 or 4 years to an embedded practice that allowed children to inform public policy on their phones on their way to school. Democracy was practiced by all daily in the last few years. Deliberative practices transformed cities by taking a design for all approach that worked primarily with those most disadvantaged by the system. Putting their needs first allowed cities to evolve into places that were truly accessible for all. Stigmas do remain, but are largely confined to the die-hard carnists who continue to hide their chickens in their backyards. Today, just 5% of meat consumed is from animals. Let us remind ourselves of how this came to be. 35 years ago, in 2020, 99% of meat sold was flesh from an animal. Back then, you could see people cutting into an animal on their plate, right in the open, in full public view. No shame. They would barely bat an eyelid in recognition as they stuck their fork into a once living, breathing brother or sister. They were quite accustomed to having a morsel of her fibrous tissue of muscle, with its ligaments attached to bone, rolling in their mouth. Indeed, as their blunt teeth struggled with the tough sinew, the flavors oozing on their palates were relished gleefully. For every human on Earth, there were 3 non-human animals in line for execution. The animal industrial complex was near its peak. If falling slightly in some parts, it continued to swell in low-income countries. In the US, its trade in body parts, flesh and fluids more than doubled in the country's military industrial complex and tripled its auto industrial complex, totaling some $2.74 trillion annually. Then our economies were seemingly more dependent upon more than human animals than the 18th century Brits were on the human slave trade. Indeed, 1 in every 8 people depended on it for its survival. In the early 2020s, Human Rights Watch identified slaughterhouse work to be one of the most dangerous jobs in the US. At that time, 2 amputations were made each week. In higher income countries, it was the most vulnerable, often migrants, people of color, and those with little education who bore the brunt of the work. The matrix of domination was rarely so obnoxiously transparent. Through the 20s and 30s, the plant-based meat alternatives took off, but it was not until 2040 that the market share of animal-based meat dropped to 40%. With a monumental rise in plant-based meat products, the appeal of animal-based meat was hard to justify. It was no longer seen as necessary. Few believed it to be natural, and it was no longer normal. People who ate animal-based meats were considered increasingly strange. Over the past 60-odd years, I have been fortunate to have met some amazing organizers and facilitators involved in the movement. I wanted to share a little about how I saw it unfold and some of the people who preceded them. This is not a story about superheroes, but super collaborators, about cooperation and solidarity. These are but a handful of the organizations and people who did what they could to help bridge the divides, to pull those people from the margins to the center. The World Economic Forum estimated we're on track to achieve income parity for women. This is in the 2020s. We're on track to receive gender parity by July 2156. Globally, women in 2020 were still earning 20% less and for every woman in parliament, there were 3 men. Votes for legislation had men outnumber women by 3 to 1. Closing the imbalance in power was said to take many years and many more years than closing the gender pay gap. It was a time when democracy across the globe was in decline. Then only 6.4% of people lived in a country that was considered truly democratic. In the 6th extinction wave, we were losing species fast, 1,000 times faster than the norm. That meant species were lost every 3 days. In 2020, when I asked zoologist Professor Andrea Manica about our prospects, he left the door open. Whether these past trends in habitat range losses will reverse, continue, or accelerate will depend on our future global carbon emissions and societal choices in the coming years and decades. It all depends on what we do next. 2 years later, I met up with Sir Robert Watson. At that time, he was the chair of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. He told me that not all was lost. We just needed transformational change. What does that mean precisely? I pressed. So Watson answered, a fundamental system-wide reorganization across technological, economic, and social factors, including paradigms, goals, and values. Elementary, dear Watson. Such optimism was the norm for the environmentalists I knew. We shared a common naivete. Without that character flaw, this transformation that Sir Watson taunted me with may not have happened. Few at that time predicted it. However, an awareness grew in the global consciousness that inequalities thrive where democracies were weak. Some argued that this was key to what Sir Watson was talking about. The transition was not linear, but momentum grew nonetheless. History is full of people who realized injustice needed to be fought, not selectively, but all and everywhere. I think this is key to allow their movement to grow into the unstoppable force it has become. In England in the early part of the 20th century, many who fought for justice, unionists, socialists, and suffragettes, considered it cruel to kill animals for food. Lady Constance Lytton, for instance, made herself vomit up the beef tea she was force-fed in prison for fighting for women's rights, to vote. Intersectional activism did not begin with the suffragettes. A Jewish man was expelled from RSPCA in London, England, in 1824. Louis Compertz was said to be a kindly, compassionate, bird-like man. Louis was a radical. He rallied against capitalism and fought vehemently for the rights of women and animals. His crime, you might ask, unlike the RSPCA, Compertz did not tolerate speciesism. Compertz neither ate, wore, or rode on animals. He was a writer and inventor seeking to reduce the suffering of animals. Wanting to free horses from slavery, Compertz worked on the early precursor to the bicycle. He was a vegan a century before the word was coined. Not only was he a founding member of the animal justice movement, Compertz was a founding member of the ecological justice movement, what is known today as the movement. Later pioneers of the movement understood the importance of fighting for people, animals, and the environment. A feminist vegan American philosopher, academic, and activist, Angela Davis, campaigned in an intersectional way her whole life. Her political activism began in the 1970s, and continued for over 50 years. Davis adamantly believed that injustices were intertwined and that common causes needed to be called out. Following in Davis's footsteps, Christopher Sebastian Jitters continued the legacy in the 2010s and 20s, doing great work in spreading the movement's justice message. Working tirelessly across fields, McJetters divided his time between teaching classes on speciesism at Columbia University, the Peace Advocacy Network, an animal rescue sanctuary, and Black Vegans Rock and a Well-Fed World. It was this kind of intersectional activism that paved the way for others to follow. Lauren Ornelas was another such pioneer. Almost 2 centuries after Combert's campaign against speciesism, Ornelas founded the Food Empowerment Project in 2007 to highlight the intersectional injustice nexus of animal abuse, environmental degradation, unfair labor conditions for agricultural workers, and a lack of healthy food in low-income areas from the United States. These were but 3 names of the thousands who played a part in galvanizing the movement. Cities had long been sites of revolution and social change. We know now cities were key. Back in the early 20s, just a few decades ago, cities shaped by the hegemonic elites, predominantly white men with large bank accounts. Vulnerable groups were generally left out in the cold, literally and figuratively. Cities now look vastly different since they're shaped by the plurality of people that work, live, and breathe there. In the 1970s, Henry Lefebvre did not only ask that marginalized groups be involved in city making, he asked that they be empowered in the process. Much like they are now, 30 years later, Richard Kahn built on Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy, given an explicitly environmental intent. Kahn developed his educational practice of eco-pedagogy as an ecological justice project that sought to empower marginalized groups, whilst raising eco-literacy and advancing environmental outcomes. Just as democracies depend on an educated electorate, so too does ecological justice. We now take all this for granted as the foundation of our education system, and indeed the principles of our democracy more broadly. Lefebvre identified accessibility to be about both participation and appropriation. This meant that urban planning must be done with and for everyone. Critical universal design and design for all ideas grew as a user-oriented approach that was inherently inclusive and participatory. Far from prescribing a particular solution to every problem, it was flexible, allowing changes to adopt to users' needs. Hence, users should be much more involved in making decisions than impact them so directly. As many scholars note, including the end users in the planning process is critical. And critical disability scholars like James Charleston and David Werner helped popularize this notion through their book, Nothing About Us Without Us. Critical universal urban design not only helps to ensure better outcomes, but also acknowledges such inclusion as a human right. It is precisely this kind of collaborative design approach that aligns with Lefebvre's notion of the rights of the city, and was instrumental in shaping cities that catered for the needs of not only those with a disability, but for those on the margins and the least advantaged. The democracy we take for granted today was not always so participatory, deliberative, or inclusive. In rhetoric, at least, participatory planning was widely used throughout the world in early 2000s. However, under a neoliberal paradigm, participatory planning was used as an instrument to manufacture consensus for technocratic perspectives. Alternatively, citizen participation processes often reproduced social inequalities and buttressed the status quo, through making some residents more welcome than others. It was uncommon for cities to empower their citizens in making decisions that had material impact on their day-to-day lives. Rarer still was it for disadvantaged groups to be actively involved in the participatory processes themselves. Thus, conventional city making in the 2020s even was anything but inclusive. However, in Brazil, they had a different approach. Their participatory budgeting approach was founded with the aim of empowering some of the most disadvantaged people. In the 1990s, Marta Simplicity was a psychiatrist educated at Stanford University who gave sex advice on a popular television show in Brazil. She was elected mayor of Sao Paulo at the dawn of the 21st century, at the helm of the Workers' Party. Simplicity used participatory budgeting to make its democracy more inclusive. Unlike most people's budgets that allocate about 4% of their budget, Sao Paulo devoted almost 2/3 of its budget across every section, every sector, not just small infrastructure projects, but through from health, policing, as well as infrastructure. Sao Paulo's people's budgets were less known than the ones in Porto Alegre, where these budgets were pioneered. But unlike its Brazilian neighbor, its people's budgets had a direct positive discrimination element built in. However, it was not through mandating quotas, but by giving vulnerable groups a disproportionately higher representation. Participants appointed representatives among themselves. 9 vulnerable groups were identified: Afro-Brazilians, senior citizens, children, adolescents, youth, the LGBTQI community, women, Indigenous groups, homeless, and people with disabilities. Whilst most representatives required 20 votes, these vulnerable groups were required between 1 to 5. People who identified themselves as having a disability, were homeless, or an Indigenous person only needed 1 vote to be a delegate. Other groups needed between 2 and 5 votes among those vulnerable groups. If someone wanted to be a delegate and identified as more than 1 vulnerable group, it would be their choice which group they want to represent. While still not immediately replicated, Sao Paulo inspired many other cities to find creative ways to make their collaborative governance practices truly inclusive for everyone. In retrospect, there were small but critical advances in democracy that galvanized the political will for transformative change. As new democracy tools were piloted, they were simultaneously shared through social media, independent media, and websites. These participatory democracies tools have been used to address a multitude of urban problems, from guerrilla gardens right through to master plans for new precinct developments. The decentralized democracy that was the Occupy movement inspired many groups to pick up the torch. One such group rose in Spain in 2013. The 15M movement were particularly important in popularizing live streams in their meetings and actions, proving both powerful pieces of communication as well as offering the kind of transparency they saw lacking in their conventional governments. Website participedia.net found that there are 343 different participatory methods across 137 countries. 30 of those methods were fully collaborative, offering substantial power for people to make real decisions. Whilst political change was once sought at the ballot box, innovations in the digital realm helped make it happen in real time. The movement formed organically as a democratic spirit filtered through the society at all levels. To ensure their workers' future, unions from the fossil fuel industry worked hand in hand with environmental groups to secure the financing needed to shut down the polluting power stations and open renewable energy plants. The Mining and Energy Union played a key role in ending Australia's dependence on the coal industry. In 2025, the union morphed into Australia's largest workers' cooperative, empowering its 20,000 members to run the country's largest renewable energy company. Workers' cooperatives were once niche, became the norm. Banks shrank as the popularity of finance cooperatives boomed. This enabled disparate social movements to coalesce, honing and amplifying the will of the people in ways that could no longer be ignored. Through these kinds of collaborations, cooperatives and micro-utopian projects, the movement overcame injustices inch by inch, neighbourhood by neighbourhood, city by city. If governments wanted to stay in power, they had to take action, action that made a meaningful difference to the neighbourhood, a difference the community could see and feel. Communities did not simply ask politely, but demanded it as if their futures depended on it. As for many, it did. This brief history covered but a sliver of the multitude of the people, ideas, and actions that turned city making upside down. Learning from history has shown that there were two keys to ushering in a more collaborative city: deepening democracy and taking a holistic view of injustice. Deepening democracy meant that those at the margins had their voices pushed front and center. Their empowerment came through their inclusion in democratic processes. Taking a holistic view meant campaigning not on one injustice at a time, but all injustices all the time. By devolving power to those who have had it least was crucial. When disparate groups began to identify with others who were marginalized, bridges could be built. Bridges linking values and institutions, engaging with groups who had been marginalized for decades or even centuries, took an immense organizational effort. However, as a united front, this ecological justice movement wielded considerable clout, as we have seen now. Yeah, I will leave you with the immortal words of the American inventor, Buckminster Fuller. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke, for that. I did have quite a few questions and comments there, but unfortunately we've gone significantly over time. So what I wanted to do was, I'll invite people to go into the chat box to offer some comments and questions there. I know I have a few as well. But what I'll do, if Roger is okay with this, I think is actually a very wonderful segue. But quickly, before I go into the survey, the segue, we're well into our break time right now. So if anyone feels like they want to get up and do whatever, like this is no strict conference office. Obviously, we're all friends and colleagues here. But we will start with the PSA panel in the next 40 minutes. So come and go as you like, but Roger's going to talk for, I think, 15, 20 minutes. Is that right, Roger?
Yeah, I'll go fast.
Well, I think this is a wonderful segue because Luke's talk is about this, imagining this vegan utopia. But as Roger's talk is going to show us, like, I love that Luke got into a lot of the details and actual strategies and how we might get there. But Roger's talk is going to demonstrate how some of those barriers are still within our own house. Like, we still have a major problem within the animal rights movement, the vegan movement, for instance, even talking about veganism. So I think this is a wonderful segue. And with that, I will turn it over to Roger. And again, please leave comments and questions in the chat for Luke and for the other speakers on the panel.
Yeah, just let me say that I won't be offended if you want to use your break time and actually have a break instead of listening to me. So this was, I'm doing a series called The Vegan Time Tunnel on Vegan, of course, which is a daily morning show from North America, which goes out at my time, that's Irish time, at 4 p.m. And so number 10 of this time tunnel is the move that the movement has made from vegetarianism or veg claims making or even vegan things to actually embracing veganism. So we tend to think now that we often say, well, veganism is now the moral baseline, or it's central to everything we do, that kind of notion. And in social movement terms or social movement theory terms, we can say that it's central to our kind of claims making now. I was a press officer in the 1980s, did lots and lots of interviews hundreds of interviews. And I don't remember talking about veganism not once. And I was never asked by a journalist once about veganism. So it was all about single issues. And so the timeline of this is not a kind of attack on anyone. I just want to make that clear. What it is, it's talking about a structural issue, that the movement wasn't geared up for veganism, even though it was, you know, an animal rights movement, not geared up for veganism. So it was safer, people thought, to talk about vegetarianism. And in fact, some people, and still now a few, will argue that veganism is still a scare word. And so there is a kind of timeline from 1990 through to about 2019 in this presentation. So we start with vegan outreach, which started in 1995, and that was Animal Liberation Action at the time. It is famous for giving out the pamphlets, and eventually they moved to vegan ones from Why Vegetarian ones. And so this is an interesting thing. Matt Ball, co-founder of Vegan Outreach, appeared on the Animal Rights Zone. This is 2011. He was asked by Tim Geyer whether, if he started all over again, would he still call it Vegan Outreach? And basically he said no. And the reason for that is that if you use vegan in your name, you're not going to get funding. And so that's basically what he was saying, that, you know, veganism is still putting a lot of people off. And so they wouldn't have done it in that sense. Meanwhile, if we go back to Britain, this is 2010. This is a talk that Robin Lane gave. Robin Lane took over from Ronnie Lee as the Animal Liberation Front press officer. But he also ran something called CARF, which was a campaign against leather and fur. And he's also involved with the Vegan Society. And he says that in 1996, there was a Vegan Society proposal by the members that they would run an annual vegan event for the public. And the membership said yes to that, but the Vegan Society didn't want to do it. They actually said that they didn't want to take on the extra work. And so we have the ironic situation that the proposal for the first major vegan event in Britain, the Vegan Society didn't want to do it. And so Robin's organization, CARF, stepped in. And so in 1998, it became the first national vegan festival. It became the London Vegan Festival in 2004 because regional events came in. So we're only talking about 18 years ago here. If we go back to, this is an old friend of mine, Neil Lee, used to put together this magazine, Arc News, and part of it was this activist thing, which you can see in the background there. It basically told you what was coming up. And again, the interesting part here, it's very difficult to read, but it's saying a vegetarian rally and picnic in Hyde Park and the National Vegetarian Week. So even though this was an activist publication being put out very regularly, veganism was hardly ever mentioned, which was interesting. Archangel, they were more likely to talk about veganism than most. This is the real kind of radical end of the movement in that sense. It was produced by the people behind the Animal Liberation Front. When we go to the more established national groups, this is Viva. And it's interesting, if you look right in the top corner, I don't know if you can see it, it says Vegetarians International Voice for Animals. So that's what Viva means. It's now rebranded as the vegan charity. But they were famous in doing things like offering veggie information. At one point, they had a vegetarian starter kit, and then they started to have a vegetarian starter kit as well as a vegan starter kit. And then you see, in the end, they ended up being kind of like a mix. Through the kind of late 90s, they ended up being a mix. There's a lot of vegetarian things going on, and then you'd throw in vegan things. The thing about the vegan material at this point, and you know, we're coming up to this century at this stage, is that it was all usually about food. In fact, even Vegan Outreach, their first focus was about food. And so the vegan stuff was thrown in as a dietary add-on to a lot of things. Again, this is a Vegetarian International Voice for Animals. This is a video from 2012. And again, we're talking about relatively late on in terms of our history as a movement. So this is the story, really, that the movement has very slowly embraced veganism as the central part of its claims making. But the national groups in particular have been very reluctant to do it. They were quite scared of the word vegan until relatively recently. And now most of them have embraced it. This is Animal Aid Outreach. And until very recently, they have publicized the Veggie Month, as they call it. So the main picture is 1999, and then you've got some kind of vegetarian kind of solutions to things like world hunger, those kind of issues. This is interesting in the sense that this is the kind of youth section of the Animal Aid magazine. And in the youth section, they were much more likely to mention veganism. And I think that's possibly because they didn't think it was such a threat to their general membership. But again, it was Veggie Month, and then you've got this little section in the middle. Think of taking the vegan pledge. If you read it, again, it's very kind of diet orientated. This is Outrage from, when is that? 2000 and something? I think it might be 2006. Still talking about Veggie Month, you know. So it was a painful transition, if you like. This guidelines for talks on vegetarianism comes from this little thing, which is a guide that they used to send out to people giving their school talks. And it says, what is vegetarian, what is veganism? And then they talk about the vegetarian and vegan diet. And so it was always translated to that. There was never any articulation that veganism was a radical philosophy. It was always about food. There was a real reluctance to really embrace it. Now, this is Ireland. This is 2001. So this was part of the foot and mouth problem that was going on at the time, which was big news at the time. But again, the claims making is vegetarian. It's kind of no more tears, or tears are not enough, go vegetarian. Then the other one from 1999, I just threw that in to show that hardly anything is new, because that's very kind of AV looking, if you like. But again, even in Ireland, as in Britain, vegetarian was the dominant word to be used. Of course, when we go to Peter and to Paul McCartney, then there's a big, strong emphasis on vegetarianism rather than veganism. McCartney has never gone vegan, and he basically says that he knows he should, and Stella, his daughter, keeps telling him he should, but he never has and probably never will. So this is Peter over the years, really. You've got Morrissey wanting people to go vegetarian. And then you got some pretty problematic things, as you normally do with Peter. Jesus was a vegetarian. Then you've got the kind of fat shaming bits at the top there, where you've got the big kind of male belly, as it were, and then save the whales, lose the blubber, go vegetarian with the obese woman figure. And then the one to the left there is from their Vegan Love porn channel. At one point, Peter had a porn channel. I think you had to be 18 plus to get into it. And essentially that was just them getting women to do sexual things with vegetables, essentially. More up to date, we've got Meat is Murder, Go Vegetarian, and that's Rise Against. That's a band. It's a straight edge band. So that was interesting to me, because straight edge is usually associated with veganism. But there is a kind of vegetarian version of it. And so that might be what's going on here. Three members of this band are straight edge. And so I assumed their message would be vegan, but it's translated to, vegetarianism. And then possibly the most shocking thing in terms of time, this main part here is from 3 years ago. So 2019. So again, it's been a long, painful process for veganism to become the core central part of our claims making. And there's been a lot of reluctance in the movement to do that. And whenever I've talked to relatively new vegans, they've been surprised by this history, that it's been a history of resisting veganism rather than embracing it. But that is the history that we actually have. This is an interesting one. This is one of the Peter Lettuce ladies. This is Canada. And there was a counter demonstration by the local grassroots animal rights groups, basically saying that, sexism isn't activism. So if we move into academia then, I just picked out a few books that I've got on my shelf. The first one is Rainbow Without Thunder by Gary Francione. So that's 1996, no mention of veganism. Introduction to Animal Rights, Your Child or the Dog, that's 2000. And there's no mention of veganism. In the Melanie Joy book, which a lot of people know, which is this one, there's no mention of veganism. Vegetarianism is cited quite a lot. So if you look at the top there, that's from the index. You've got lots and lots of references to vegetarianism and none to veganism. And Melanie Joy said to AR Zone that was a tactical thing to do, again, on the assumption that that veganism was a scare word. And then on page 131, which I always like to point out, there's a kind of footnote from Melanie herself, and we don't rule out footnotes in the sense that, think about Jeremy Bentham and the important footnote that he produced. She said that she talked about vegans being pure vegetarians, but she basically says that she thinks that even vegans don't find eggs and milk products as disgusting as flesh. And she said that she suspects the reason for that is because you can procure eggs and dairy products without violence, which is an extraordinarily non-vegan thing to say. It's interesting, really, because one mystery for me personally is why the vegan society seems to have embraced carnism, the concept of carnism, which essentially is a vegetarian concept, but they seem to embrace it. I suspect it's because if you call somebody a carnist, it's a bit of an insult, you're a carnist, you are, type of thing. It doesn't quite work if saying you're a speciesist. So I think that's probably what's going on there. Now, this is really interesting. This is Francione again. Again, it's not a personal attack. He used to run something called the Animal Rights Clinic with his partner, Anne Charlton. So this is 1996. And he's talking here about going for a meal with somebody. And one person orders a burger, I think, and he orders the veggie burger, I think. And so somebody says, well, are you still a vegetarian? And his answer to that was, yes, I'm still very much a vegetarian. So this is a really interesting thing, because Gary Francione says he went vegan in 1982 after reading Fettered Kingdoms by John Bryant, which is a good book. And so 14 years after going vegan, he was still self-identifying as a vegetarian, which from our point of view right now is quite an extraordinary thing to do. We probably wouldn't do that. Although, funny enough, I did see on social media, I think about 2 days ago, somebody saying that in social settings, they will say that they're vegetarian, but they won't say they're vegan. So perhaps it is an issue that continues. So then we bring into the real move towards veganism as the central part of the movement. And you could, if you wanted to, date it from Earthlings, which is 2005. The Earthlings Experience was also 2005. I always like to think that the first column there, you might not be able to see it, but it's got the Earthlings Experience Dublin under the UK banner, which I hope nobody from Dublin has seen that, but they probably wouldn't like it. So you've got the Earthlings Experience. Now, Earthlings Experience is what essentially AV, Anonymous for the Voiceless, kind of ripped off and professionalized, if you like. But AV has only been going since 2016. So again, very recent in our times. And then finally, on our whistle top tour, we've got Go Vegan World. Go Vegan World was started in 2015, but that was Go Vegan Island in those days. And then from 2016, it's been Go Vegan World. And so I suppose most people are probably aware of their big, massive billboards. These are not photoshopped. These are actual photographs of billboards. They also have a downloadable vegan guide, which is pretty good. And so, and a really good kind of website. So this is a story, and apologies for rushing through it so quick, but this is a story of our movement. We do have a few people in the movement who suggest that these are the ones who want to bring back pressure campaigning. They suggest that we've been doing vegan outreach and vegan education for decades and decades, and it hasn't done any good. Now, that claim is not correct, in the sense that historically, vegan outreach as we know it now has just begun. You know, I always talk with Ronnie Lee. We were about to start a program together. He's celebrating his 50th year of a vegan. And he says, again, back in the 80s and 90s, they were all vegan, but they never talked about veganism. It wasn't a campaign in those days. And so things have radically changed now. And veganism is now the moral baseline of the movement. But it's new. And so the big increase in veganism, as we've all probably experienced, is due to this switch, I would suggest, which was led by the grassroots. I often say that the national groups were kind of dragged kicking and screaming into veganism because the grassroots pushed for it. And I think we had to prove to them that veganism wasn't a scare word. And I think also commerce did it in the sense that you ended up with Greggs and in Ireland, Apple Green, filling stations, as it were. They had big billboards. It's here, the vegan sausage roll and this kind of stuff. And I think that combination of all these vegan things coming through and the grassroots has finally convinced the national groups that veganism is not a scare word. And I suppose if it was, it wouldn't be in all those packaging. They can quite easily put plant-based, but they put vegan. So I don't think it is, you know, a scare word in that sense. So I think we've had a paradigm shift, but it's taken a long time to get here. But here we are now for the future. Let's see if I can close this down. What do I do? Do I exit that? Stop. That's it, isn't it? Right. Yeah, sorry for the speed of all that, but I know that we were short on time, so I didn't want to take your break up too much. But if you do have any questions, I'm happy to take them.